The day began like a whisper, a low unease that neither Ross nor Gina could name. Gina had been restless the evening before, her swollen belly tightening in intervals that grew sharper, closer together. She told herself it was nothing, that after 2 miscarriages, she had learned not to overreact, to wait until she was certain before sending her husband into a panic. But deep down she knew something wasn't right. Ross, hunched over his laptop in the corner of their small living room, half listening to a client call, felt the shift in her breathing. It was ragged, uneven, a sound he recognized after 14 years of marriage. He turned, worry already written across his face. "Gina." She tried to smile, as if to steady him. "I think it's time." The words dropped like stones into the air between them. He was on his feet in seconds, closing his laptop without a word, his mind racing through the checklist they'd rehearsed but never really expected to use tonight. The hospital bag. Cyrene, their 14-year-old daughter, appeared in the hallway, her expression pale, eyes darting between her parents. She had overheard. She always overheard more than they wanted her to. "Is it happening?" she whispered. Ross forced a smile for her, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Yes, take a deep breath, sweetheart. Your grandmother is on her way. She will be with you for a few days." Cyrene nodded, but her lips trembled. She had lived through the silent grief of 2 pregnancies that ended too soon, had watched her mother retreat into a silence she could not break. She wanted to ask if this time would be different, but she knew better. No one could promise that. The journey was a blur, red lights, city streets that seemed longer than ever, Gina's muffled groans as she gripped the seatbelt across her belly. Ross tried to keep his voice steady, reassuring her every few minutes. "We're almost there. Hold on, you're doing so well." Inside, though, panic consumed him. He had read enough about premature labor to know that time was everything. And they weren't ready, not tonight, not like this. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights felt merciless. Nurses swept Gina into a wheelchair, questions spilling faster than Ross could answer them. How far along? Any complications? Previous miscarriages? He answered like a machine, his voice flat, his hand still clutching Gina, until it was pulled away. "Emergency cesarean," the doctor announced after one look at Gina's vitals. "We need to move quickly." Ross's breath caught. He leaned down to kiss Gina's damp forehead. "I'll be right here," he whispered, though both of them knew he wouldn't be allowed inside. Her fingers squeezed his once before she was wheeled through swinging doors that shut with a hollow thud, leaving him staring at his own reflection in the glass. For the next hour, time became meaningless. He paced, he prayed, he thought about the first miscarriage, how Gina had crumpled in his arms, whispering, "I failed." He thought about the second one, how Cyrene had left a drawing on their bed of a stick-figure family with an empty space in the middle. They had told themselves this pregnancy would be different, had tried to believe in second chances. When the doors finally opened, a nurse emerged carrying the smallest bundle Ross had ever seen. "It's a boy," she said, but her smile was thin. "He's breathing, but very weak. He needs to go to the NICU immediately." Ross reached out instinctively, but the nurse shook her head. "Not yet, sir." And just like that, his son was gone, carried into another room, hooked to machines Ross couldn't see, fighting battles Ross couldn't fight for him. Gina was brought out hours later, pale and drifting in and out of consciousness, but alive. That was something, that was everything. Ross bent to kiss her, whispering thanks to God, to the doctors, to anyone listening. But when Gina's cracked lips formed the word baby, he felt the weight of all the fear he'd been holding crash down on him. "He's in the NICU," Ross said carefully. "They're taking care of him." Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to smile, but the effort cost her. Her body sank back against the pillows, her hands searching weakly for his. And in that moment, Ross realized this was only the beginning. The NICU was another world entirely, a place where silence carried the weight of thunder, and every beep of a machine could lift or shatter hope. When Ross first entered, dressed in the flimsy hospital gown they handed him, he almost couldn't breathe. Rows of incubators stretched before him, each one a fragile universe of plastic walls, wires, and impossibly small infants. His gaze landed on the one labeled with their surname, and his knees almost buckled. Inside lay his son, RR, the name they had whispered in excitement months ago when hope still felt safe. He was tiny, his skin almost translucent, his chest rising and falling with effort beneath a web of tubes and wires. His hands were no bigger than Ross's fingertips. Ross pressed his palm against the glass, aching to touch him, to scoop him up and shield him from everything cruel in the world. But all he could do was stand there, whisper his name, and trust strangers in scrubs to keep his child alive. When Gina was finally well enough to be wheeled in days later, Ross braced himself. She gasped softly at the sight, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision as she leaned forward, straining to see him through the glass. "He's so small," she whispered. Ross wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "He's strong, stronger than he looks." But even as he said it, doubt gnawed at him. The nurses had explained the risks: underdeveloped lungs, fragile immunity, the constant possibility of infection. 45 days in the NICU, maybe more, bills piling by the hour. And yet, looking at Gina's face, he knew he couldn't let her see his fear. He had to be her anchor, even if he was drowning himself. Cyrene visited a week later, her school uniform still creased from the day. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Ross guided her in, his hand gentle on her back. When she saw her baby brother, her breath caught. "He's so little." Gina reached for her hand, pulling her closer. "He's fighting 8, she said softly. "He knows you're here." Cyrene nodded, blinking rapidly. She wanted to ask if he would make it, if this time would end in another grave silence. But she swallowed the words because she didn't want to see her mother break again. Instead, she whispered, "Hi, RR, it's me, your big sister." Ross watched her, pride and sorrow mingling in his chest. At 14, she should have been worrying about school dances and silly crushes, not hospital bills and NICU machines. But life had given her this, and she was rising to it with a quiet strength that humbled him. Nights blurred into days. Ross worked remote hours from hospital waiting rooms, his laptop balanced on his knees, headset muffling the sounds of machines behind glass. Clients had no idea that as he talked strategy, his son's oxygen levels were dipping or stabilizing a few feet away. He carried the weight of hospital bills like stones in his pocket, each one heavier than the last. And yet, every morning when Gina whispered RR's name like a prayer, and every evening when Cyrene kissed her baby brother's incubator goodnight, Ross found just enough strength to keep going. Because even in the darkest moments, when the future felt like a knife's edge, one truth anchored him: they were still here, all 4 of them, and together they would find a way. The days after RR's birth blended into a strange rhythm, a cadence shaped not by the sun or the clock, but by the machines in the NICU. Each beep, each flicker of numbers on the monitor dictated their emotions: relief when the oxygen levels rose, dread when the alarms shrilled without warning. Ross learned to hold his breath without realizing it, waiting for the nurses' calm voices to reassure him. "He's okay, just a dip." The first time the monitor wailed, he thought his knees would give out. Gina clutched his hand so tightly he thought the bones might crack, her eyes wide, her lips forming silent prayers. Every visit began the same way, scrubbing hands until their skin was raw, donning gowns and masks, moving carefully into the sterile room that held their son. They couldn't hold him yet, not truly. Instead, they hovered, their palms pressed against the clear walls of the incubator, whispering his name like a secret charm. "RR," Gina would say, her voice soft but fierce. "It's Mama, I'm here." Ross followed, leaning close. "It's Papa, you're not alone, son, keep fighting." Sometimes, when the machines were quiet and his breathing steady, Ross swore he could see RR twitch, a tiny movement of fingers or a turn of his head, as though answering back. The hospital became their second home. Gina, still healing from the emergency cesarean, moved slowly, wincing with each step. Yet nothing could keep her from the NICU. Nurses urged her to rest, to stay in bed, but she pushed herself each day, shuffling down the hall to see RR. At night, when the pain grew sharpest, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling tiles. Memories of the miscarriages crept back uninvited. The first had left her hollow, convinced she had betrayed her own body. The second had nearly broken her spirit altogether. Both times, Cyrene had crept into her room, pressing little notes into her hand. "It's not your fault, Mama. We will be okay." Now staring at Ara through the glass, Gina wondered if this miracle would hold. She wanted to believe in strength, in survival, but the fear was constant, a shadow that followed her every thought. She looked at Ross sometimes and saw the same fear hidden behind his weary smile. Ross carried his burdens differently. He split his days between the NICU and his laptop, juggling deadlines with hospital rounds. His clients saw only a calm professional on their screens, unaware that between meetings, he ran to check Ara's vitals or whispered reassurances to Gina. He learned to type reports with one hand while holding his wife's fingers with the other. The bills, however, were harder to balance than any workload. Every day new charges appeared. The NICU bed, the specialist consultations, the medications, the oxygen. Ross kept a spreadsheet that grew longer and longer, the numbers marching down the screen like an army he could never defeat. At night, after Gina finally dozed off, Ross would sit alone in the hospital cafeteria with his laptop open, his brow furrowed. He cut expenses ruthlessly, subscriptions cancelled, unnecessary purchases postponed, even little comforts for Cyrene deferred. Each adjustment felt like stealing from his family, but there was no choice. Still, when the totals at the bottom of the spreadsheet glared back at him, his chest tightened. How long could they keep this up? Cyrene navigated the days with a quiet resilience, though Ross and Gina both saw the weight she carried. At 14, she was too young to understand the full scope of medical jargon, but old enough to sense the danger hovering over them. Her afternoons were spent between school and the hospital, homework spread across waiting room tables while her parents moved in and out of NICU visits. Sometimes she would read aloud softly, her voice drifting toward the incubator. "Today in class we learned about constellations," she told Ara one evening. "There's one called Orion. It's a hunter. Maybe when you get bigger we'll look at the stars together. I'll show you which one is Orion, and you'll know it's watching over you." Gina, overhearing, felt her throat tighten. Cyrene was no longer just a child. She was stepping into a role she hadn't asked for: sister, comforter, almost a second mother. There were moments when guilt stabbed Gina so sharply she had to look away. She worried that in fighting for Ara, they were asking too much of Cyrene, forcing her to grow faster than she should. But Cyrene never complained. She simply adjusted, carrying her quiet worries home in her notebook, scribbling them in the margins of her math homework. What if he doesn't make it? What if Mama gets sick again? She never showed them to anyone, afraid that saying the words aloud would make them come true. The NICU stretched time in strange ways. Weeks passed, marked not by calendars but by milestones. The day Ara gained a few precious grams, the first time his oxygen support was lowered, the moment the doctor allowed Gina to place a hand inside the incubator and let him curl his tiny fingers around hers. That touch undid her. She wept openly, her forehead pressed to the plastic wall, whispering over and over, "Mama's here, Mama's here." Ross had to steady her, his own eyes blurring. Later, when the nurse told them Ara had made it through a critical 72-hour window with steady vitals, Ross nearly collapsed in relief. He walked out of the NICU, down the hall, and into the hospital chapel, where he dropped into a pew and let the tears come. He hadn't cried like that in years, silent, heaving sobs that racked his chest until he could hardly breathe. He prayed, not in polished words, but in raw fragments, "Please, just let him live. I'll carry the rest." But the fight was far from over. Each day carried new challenges. Infections loomed like storms, sudden dips in oxygen clawed their way back without warning, and the doctors remained cautious in their optimism. Ross and Gina clung to each other through it all. Their conversations grew practical, almost military, dividing shifts, balancing Cyrene's needs, organizing bills. Yet beneath the logistics ran a deep current of love, quiet touches in hallways, whispered encouragements, the simple act of holding hands while watching their son fight. For Gina, the NICU was a test of faith. For Ross, it was a test of endurance. For Cyrene, it was both, a lesson in resilience too heavy for her age. And through it all, Ara lay in his glass cocoon, small but stubborn, proving each day that even the tiniest heart could hold unimaginable strength. For Cyrene, the world had tilted months before her brother's birth, when her mother's miscarriages hung like ghosts in their house. She was old enough to know that Barbies were supposed to come home, to be held and sung to, but twice she had watched her mother retreat into silence, her father hovering like a shadow at her side. At 14, she hadn't had the words to describe the strange ache of those days. Instead, she had carried it in silence, doodling questions in the margins of her notebooks. Why did it happen? Did I do something wrong? Why does Mama cry at night? When her mother's belly began to swell again, she wanted desperately to believe this time would be different. She pressed her palm against Gina's stomach, whispering, "Stay, little one, stay with us." When Ara came early, torn from Gina's womb in an emergency she only half understood, Cyrene felt the same cold fear she had carried before. Now, in the antiseptic light of the hospital, she walked the thin line between child and adult. She wore her school uniform, her hair pulled back, her backpack heavy with books. But when she sat beside her mother, holding Gina's hand while nurses checked vitals, she felt years older than her classmates. Sometimes she hated herself for resenting it. Her friends spoke of crushes, weekend outings, TikTok videos gone viral. She nodded and smiled, but her mind wandered back to the NICU, to the sound of machines and the sight of her brother's tiny chest rising and falling. It was in the quiet moments, late at night when she lay in her room, the muffled hum of the city outside, that her fears returned most strongly. What if Ara didn't come home? What if she had to watch her mother grieve again? The thought made her throat tighten until she pressed her face into her pillow, letting the tears soak silently into the fabric. But in the hospital, she never cried. She stood tall beside her parents, listening as doctors spoke in careful tones. She watched Ross scribble notes and Gina nod with tired determination. And she whispered to her brother through the incubator wall, telling him about her day, about the silly things her classmates said, about the dreams she had for him. "You're going to be okay," she told him once, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "You have to be, because I've been waiting for you." Gina heard those words and felt her heart twist. She had worried so often that the miscarriages had carved a hollow space in her daughter's heart, a place filled with questions and sadness. Hearing Cyrene speak so fiercely to Ara, she realized that grief had also carved strength, shaping her daughter into someone both tender and resilient. Ross saw it too. He often returned from late-night calls to find Cyrene sitting by Gina's bedside, their hands entwined, a quiet solidarity between them. He would pause in the doorway, overcome by both pride and sorrow. His daughter was growing up faster than he wanted, shouldering more than she should, and yet without her, their fragile balance might have collapsed altogether. The days stretched into weeks, 45 of them, each one etched into memory with its own rhythm of fear and small triumphs. Ara gained weight slowly, each gram celebrated like a victory. He fought infections, endured tests, and startled them all with his stubborn grip on life. Gina marked the progress with the precision of a diary. Day 10, oxygen down. Day 17, no alarms all night. Day 23, first time he opened his eyes while I was beside him. Those small details became her anchor, proof that Ara was not just surviving, but inching toward living. Ross, for his part, lived in dual worlds. By day, he was the professional behind a screen, calm and composed as he attended meetings and delivered reports. By night, he was the father counting coins, shifting bills, finding ways to keep them afloat. He felt the weight of being provider more acutely than ever, not just financially but emotionally. Gina and Cyrene leaned on him, and though he sometimes wanted to crumble under the pressure, he pressed forward. There were moments, though, when the cracks showed. Once, after a particularly long day of setbacks in the NICU, Ross closed his laptop and simply stared at his reflection in the darkened screen. His face looked older, lined with exhaustion. He wondered briefly if anyone truly saw the quiet sacrifices, the missed meals, the restless nights, the constant, gnawing fear. Then Gina appeared beside him, laying her head on his shoulder. "You're holding us together," she whispered. "Don't think I don't see it." For Cyrene, the NICU became less a place of fear and more a place of quiet vigil. She learned the names of the nurses, recognized the rhythm of the machines, even grew accustomed to the smell of antiseptic. When friends asked where she had been, she shrugged. At the hospital, she didn't elaborate, didn't explain the weight of watching her brother's tiny chest rise and fall, but in her heart, something was shifting. She began to dream not of what might be lost, but of what might be. She pictured holding him, teaching him to walk, showing him how to ride a bike. In the stillness of the waiting room, she scribbled little sketches of a boy with big eyes and a stubborn smile. Underneath she wrote, "Our fighter." When the day finally came that the doctors spoke the words, "He's stable enough to prepare for discharge soon," Cyrene felt something bloom inside her, a fragile joy she had been too afraid to claim before. Gina wept openly, clutching Ross's arm, while Ross bowed his head, whispering thanks he had no words for. The NICU had been their crucible, 45 days that stretched their hearts, their patience, and their faith. They had walked through fear, through exhaustion, through the weight of bills and the ache of uncertainty. Yet they had also discovered something unbreakable, the bond between them, the strength they carried as a family. And when Ara was finally placed in Gina's arms, free of wires and tubes, Ross felt the world steady beneath his feet for the first time in weeks. Cyrene leaned in close, her eyes shining, whispering, "Welcome home, little brother." It was only the beginning of their journey, but for now, it was enough.